The morning started quietly on Maplewood Drive, the kind of silence that hides a storm underneath. Gregory Harlan sat on his porch with a cup of coffee, the soft hum of the neighborhood floating around him. Birds chirped, sprinklers hissed. But beneath the calm, something was off. That uneasy kind of stillness right before trouble shows its face. He had lived in that house for almost 6 years, long enough to know the rhythm of every sound. He knew which car engine belonged to which neighbor, which mailbox squeaked, and which window light always turned on first. But this morning felt different. He didn't know it yet, but before the sun would set, his name would echo across every news station in Georgia. Down the street, Sandra Whitmore, president of the Maplewood Homeowners Association, was on her porch too, phone pressed against her ear. Her tone sharp, commanding. She wasn't talking about neighborhood beautification this time. No, today she was talking about him. She had spent months trying to get Gregory to take down the flag hanging on his porch, a thin, blue line flag. "It's not appropriate," she had said. "It divides people." Gregory had smiled politely and said, "Ma'am, I've worn that line for 22 years. It doesn't divide me from anyone. It reminds me of why I serve." But Sandra wasn't the kind of woman who accepted no for an answer. By noon that same day, 2 men in cheap tactical gear parked a dark SUV in front of Gregory's home. They looked official enough to fool anyone at first glance. Badges, radios, even fake name tags. One knocked sharply on the door. "Mr. Harlan, we have a warrant for your arrest." Gregory opened the door calmly, eyes scanning their uniforms. Something wasn't right. Their boots were clean, too clean. The badge numbers didn't match the format his department used. He stepped outside slowly, his voice steady. "Which department did you say you were with again?" The taller one hesitated. "Douglas County Task Force." Gregory smiled faintly. "That's funny," he said. "I am Douglas County." Before they could react, his security system beeped, every camera now recording. "You boys picked the wrong house," he said quietly. Within minutes, 3 real squad cars pulled up, lights flashing. Neighbors peeked through their blinds as the scene unfolded. 2 fake cops cuffed and pressed against their own SUV. Sandra Whitmore stood frozen by her mailbox. Her phone still in her hand, color drained from her face. Gregory didn't shout. He didn't gloat. He just stood there, silent, watching the chaos that someone else had invited to his doorstep. When an officer asked if he wanted to press charges, he said only, "Record everything. Let the truth do the talking." That night, the entire neighborhood buzzed with whispers. People wanted to know who the men were, who had sent them, and why they had targeted the police chief who lived among them. But Gregory already knew. Deep down, he knew whose hand had moved the pieces. The following morning, doorbell footage began circulating online, the fake uniforms, the confrontation. Sandra's voice faintly audible in the background. Within hours, reporters were on Maplewood Drive, their vans lining the street. What had started as an act of arrogance was about to explode into a national story. Inside his home, Gregory poured himself another cup of coffee. The same porch, the same flag. But now, every sip tasted like proof. Proof that silence could sometimes be louder than anger. Outside, Sandra sat in her car, trembling. She had wanted to teach him a lesson. Instead, she had taught the entire neighborhood one. By the time the police hauled the imposters away, half the neighborhood had gathered along the sidewalks, whispering, recording, wide-eyed with disbelief. The quiet cul-de-sac had turned into a live courtroom. Gregory turned to one of his officers. "Get a copy of that doorbell footage," he said evenly. "Yes, sir," came the reply. He glanced once toward Sandra, who stood frozen beside her car, her hand trembling against the door. She had started this thinking she was above consequence. Now she stood beneath the full weight of it. Gregory gave her one final look before heading back to his porch. "You should have just left me alone," he said softly. Then he closed the door behind him. Inside, the smell of coffee still lingered from the morning, now cold in the cup he'd abandoned. The clock ticked steadily, marking the calm after a storm that had only just begun. Because while the fake cops were gone, the real fallout was just beginning. The legal part would be easy. The truth part, the one that would rip through the illusion of Maplewood's perfect community, that was going to test everyone. By sunrise, Maplewood Drive looked like a movie set after the cameras stopped rolling. Perfect lawns, empty streets, fake peace. But the air felt different, heavier. People who once waved at Sandra now crossed to the other side of the street when she walked her dog. And those who used to whisper about Gregory fell silent when he passed by. He didn't have to defend himself. The evidence already had. The footage from his doorbell camera, every detail of that morning, every second of Sandra's plan collapsing, had been handed straight to investigators. By mid-morning, the story had already broken. Channel 5 Atlanta ran the headline, "Attempted Impersonation of Law Enforcement Targets Local Police Chief." At first, the HOA's name wasn't mentioned. But it didn't take long. Within hours, neighbors leaked emails, texts, and board messages, all pointing to Sandra Whitmore. Screenshots surfaced. "We'll teach him a lesson. Make sure he's embarrassed." Harold Dean, Gregory's old friend and next-door neighbor, was sitting on his porch when reporters started driving by. "You really stirred up a hornet's nest, didn't you?" Harold called out as Gregory approached. Gregory gave a tired smile. "Didn't mean to. I just wanted to drink my coffee in peace." Harold chuckled. "Yeah, well, half these folks pretending they didn't side with her. I remember the looks they gave you." "I do too," Gregory said quietly. "People don't like being reminded of what they ignored." Later that afternoon, his phone rang. Detective Rhonda Stillwell, the lead investigator. "Chief," she said, tone firm but sympathetic. "We've confirmed it." The two men confessed. They were paid in cash by a woman named Sandra Whitmore. Said she told them you were a problem neighbor. They didn't even know who you were until we booked them. Gregory was silent for a moment. "Did they say why she wanted it to look like an arrest?" Her words were, and I quote, "to scare him straight." He exhaled deeply. "You got enough to charge her?" "Oh, plenty," Stillwell said. "False impersonation, conspiracy, harassment, the list's long. But I thought you'd want to know before it hits the press." "Just make sure it's clean," Gregory said quietly. "Too late for that, Chief. It's already trending." By evening, the internet had exploded. Comment sections filled with rage, shock, and disbelief. But one headline stood above them all. "HOA president under investigation after orchestrating fake arrest attempt on black police chief." Sandra's name was now everywhere. The next morning, she sent an email to every resident, an apology disguised as damage control. "I deeply regret the misunderstanding. My actions were intended to protect our community standards, not harm anyone." The email backfired instantly. Within hours, screenshots were shared online. Reporters called it tone-deaf. By noon, her resignation was demanded by nearly every member of the board. Meanwhile, Gregory's inbox filled with messages, neighbors who had ignored him for years suddenly writing to say, "We always respected you," or "We never supported her." He didn't respond. He didn't need to. He could recognize guilt when it tried to sound friendly. That evening, Harold showed up again, carrying another six-pack. He sat down beside Gregory and said, "You know, man, I've lived here 30 years. Never seen someone handle something like that with that much composure." Gregory smiled faintly. "Anger makes noise, Harold. Dignity leaves evidence." They clinked cans and sat in silence, watching kids ride bikes down the street, a street that finally, almost, felt peaceful again. But just as the night began to settle, Gregory's phone buzzed. A message, unknown number. He opened it, a photo of his own front yard taken from across the street. The text read, "You may have won, but you don't belong here." Gregory stared at it for a long moment, then forwarded it straight to Detective Stillwell. No anger, no fear, just resolve. He was done fighting shadows, but he knew the story wasn't over yet, because what the world saw as one, woman's prejudice was really something deeper, a mirror held, up to an entire community. By the following week, Maplewood Drive still looked picture-perfect, but the atmosphere had changed forever. The board's website posted a sterile statement. Due to recent events, Mrs. Whitmore will no longer be serving as HOA president. No apology. No context. Just silence pretending everything was normal. But nothing was normal. Not anymore. Residents avoided Sandra's house. Her once perfect garden now looked like a stage after the play had ended. Curtains drawn, reporters gone, but the echo still there. She spent her days whispering to lawyers, avoiding cameras, hiding behind blinds. Gregory, meanwhile, carried on exactly as before. Same truck, same lawn, same quiet dignity. He didn't gloat. He didn't celebrate. He just lived. Then, one Wednesday, a community meeting was called at Douglas County Hall. Detective Stillwell phoned him that morning. "You might want to come, Chief. People have questions. Some about you." When Gregory arrived, the room was packed. Cameras, reporters, city officials. Sandra sat 3 rows ahead, her lawyer beside her, eyes hollow but her chin still lifted, as if clinging to the last fragment of her pride. The moderator cleared his throat. "We're here to discuss the recent impersonation incident and the ongoing HOA investigation." Stillwell presented her report, every text, every payment, every confession. Then she read Sandra's message aloud. "Make sure he sees the badge." "I want him to feel it," the room gasped. Sandra shrank in her seat. Then Gregory was called to speak. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and stepped to the microphone. Cameras flashed. "I've served in law enforcement for 22 years, he began. "I've seen people do a lot of wrong things for a lot of bad reasons. But this wasn't just about me. It was about the idea that some people still believe they can decide who belongs and who doesn't." He paused, voice calm, steady. "I moved into that neighborhood because I believed in community. Because I thought respect meant belonging, not control. What happened wasn't about power. It was about fear, fear dressed up as authority." He looked straight at Sandra. "Authority without accountability isn't strength. It's weakness, hiding behind paperwork." A few people clapped quietly. Most just sat in silence, letting the truth settle like dust that would never quite clear. Outside, reporters swarmed him. "Chief Harlan, are you pressing charges? Do you plan to move? How do you feel about your neighbors now?" He gave one answer. "I'm not moving. This is my home." That line, 5 words, became a headline by evening. "Police chief refuses to leave after HOA scandal. This is my home." It spread across the country. Some called it a story about race. Others called it a story about power. But Gregory didn't care what anyone called it. For him, it was about truth, the quiet kind that doesn't need to shout once it's seen. The headlines hit like a thunderclap. By sunrise, every local channel had the same breaking banner. HOA President Sandra Miller faces investigation. Overnight, the story of Maplewood Drive turned from a quiet neighborhood feud into a full-blown scandal. Reporters camped outside the gates, vans lined up along the sidewalks, and microphones pointed at every open door. Gregory watched it all unfold from his porch, coffee in hand, the same place where everything had started. His name was no longer being dragged through the mud, now it was Sandra's. Karma had finally changed its address, but Gregory didn't smile. There was no satisfaction, no triumph in his eyes, just a long, quiet sigh. Because he knew truth doesn't always heal right away. Sometimes it just exposes wounds that were already there. By mid-afternoon, HOA members began resigning one by one. Emails leaked, text messages surfaced. Documents that showed years of bias, fines targeting specific families, and personal grudges disguised as community regulations. Harold came by that evening, shaking his head. "Man, you were right about her all along," he said, setting a beer on the table. "They're saying she even used HOA funds for her own backyard remodel." Gregory just nodded. Power has a funny way of showing people who they really are. Across the street, Sandra's blinds stayed shut. Her perfect lawn, once the envy of Maplewood, now felt like a crime scene, a reminder of how quickly control can turn into corruption. The days that followed were chaos. Reporters swarmed the HOA building. The once proud sign that read Maplewood Community, where neighbors care, was vandalized overnight. Someone had spray-painted a single word across it: lies. Inside his home, Gregory avoided the cameras. He wasn't interested in interviews or fame. He had already spoken his truth. Now he wanted peace. But peace, he learned, doesn't come just because the noise fades. It comes when you stop letting other people define your worth. Late one evening, he received a letter, not from the HOA, not from a lawyer, but from Sandra herself. It was short. Apologetic, but careful. Gregory, I never meant for things to go that far. I was under pressure, and I let things spiral. I hope someday you'll understand. He read it twice, then folded it neatly and placed it in the drawer. Not out of forgiveness, but closure. Because forgiveness, he realized, wasn't about erasing what she did. It was about not letting it live rent-free in his heart anymore. The next morning, the street was quieter than it had been in months. No news vans, no whispers. Just the soft hum of sprinklers and kids riding bikes pretending the world hadn't changed. But Gregory knew better. It had. He walked to his mailbox, noticing a few neighbors looking away as he passed. Some smiled nervously, others avoided eye contact altogether. He didn't blame them. Guilt has a way of making people silent. When he opened the mailbox, there was a single envelope, official HOA letterhead. He hesitated for a moment, then tore it open. Effective immediately, the Maplewood HOA board is disbanded pending legal review. All community decisions will be temporarily suspended. He stood there for a long moment, reading it over and over before letting out a quiet breath. For the first time in a long time, there was no committee left to judge him. No fabricated violations, no forced apologies. Just silence. And maybe, somewhere inside it, a hint of justice. That night, Harold stopped by again, beer in hand, grin on his face. "Guess the Queen lost her crown," he said. Gregory smirked faintly. "Maybe. But the kingdom's still learning." They sat under the porch light, listening to the distant sound of crickets. Neither man said much. They didn't have to. The neighborhood's story was no longer about one man's humiliation. It was about what happens when power is abused and silence becomes complicity, because every community, no matter how perfect it looks, hides its own cracks. And sometimes, it takes one person standing still to make everyone else see them. As the wind brushed through the trees, Gregory leaned back and whispered to himself, "Sometimes justice doesn't roar, it just waits." The following week brought a strange calm to Maplewood Drive. The noise, the flashing cameras, the gossip, all gone. Yet beneath the silence, something uneasy lingered. People went about their lives, pretending things were back to normal. But Gregory could feel it. The air was heavier, the smiles thinner. Every morning, he jogged the same route he always had, past the bakery on Old Mill Road, around the park where the swing still creaked in the wind. Nothing about the neighborhood looked different. But everything felt different. It's funny, he thought, how quickly people forget who you are once the world stops watching. At the grocery store, a few neighbors still nodded politely, though most looked away. A couple even switched aisles when they saw him coming. Maybe it was guilt, maybe shame, or maybe they just didn't want to be reminded of their silence. Harold noticed it too. "They're scared," he told Gregory one evening. "Not of you, but of what you represent. You stood up when no one else did. That's uncomfortable for people who didn't." Gregory gave a faint smile. Maybe discomfort is how change starts. Across the street, Sandra's house remained dark most nights. Curtains drawn. Lawn overgrown. Rumor had it she was selling. Gregory didn't wish her harm, but he also didn't pity her. Every choice has a price. Hers had just come due. One rainy afternoon, as Gregory was cleaning out his garage, he found an old file box labeled HOA Notices. He stared at it for a long moment, then took it outside and set it beside the trash bin. The papers inside had once defined his every move: fines for imaginary violations, warnings for unapproved decorations. Now, they meant nothing. He watched the box soak under the drizzle until the ink began to run. The words faded like memories he no longer needed. Later that week, a city official came by with paperwork, formal closure of the investigation. "You're cleared, Mr. Harlan," the man said. No wrongdoing found on your part? Gregory nodded. Thank you. When the man left, Gregory stood alone on his porch, looking out across Maplewood Drive. For the first time in months, the street felt quiet, peaceful, the kind of peace that isn't loud or proud, just earned. That night, Harold joined him again. Same old habit, same 2 chairs, same 6-pack. You ever think, Harold said after a pause, that all this had to happen for folks to finally see? Gregory thought for a moment, then replied softly, maybe the truth needed a villain before it could find a hero. The wind rustled the trees. Porch lights flickered on one by one. Life was creeping back, slowly, cautiously, but not the same. Maplewood would never forget what it had seen, and neither would Gregory. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes, thinking about everything Sandra had done, everything she'd tried to destroy. Yet in the end, it wasn't her downfall that mattered. It was his endurance. Because sometimes strength isn't about winning. It's about standing still when the storm wants you to run. And in that quiet moment under the soft hum of the streetlight, Gregory realized he hadn't just survived the chaos. He had changed it. She froze on the doorstep, unsure whether to speak. Gregory gave her a small nod, not of forgiveness, but acknowledgement. It was the kind of nod that said, "You did this. Now live with it." She opened her mouth as if to say something, but no words came out. Instead, she turned away and slipped quietly back inside. The door shut behind her, soft but final. Later that afternoon, Harold showed up, holding his usual 6-pack and that same easy grin. "You think that's the last we'll hear of her?" he asked, settling into the chair beside Gregory. Gregory shrugged. "Probably not. But that's okay. I'm not fighting her anymore. I've got nothing left to prove." Harold let out a low chuckle. "Man, you handled all this better than anyone I've ever known. I would have lost it." Gregory looked toward the street where kids were playing basketball near the cul-de-sac. "If I'd lost it," he said quietly, "I'd have given her exactly what she wanted." Sometimes the best revenge is staying calm long enough for people to see who's really out of control. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the soft bounce of the ball, the echo of laughter. The world outside was still watching, but here on Maplewood Drive, life was finally beginning to breathe again. That night, as Gregory turned off the porch light, he thought about everything that had happened, how one person's hatred had exposed an entire community's silence, and how the truth had forced everyone to look at themselves differently. But for Gregory, the real reckoning wasn't about punishment. It was about perspective. Because when a man's dignity is tested, how he responds becomes his legacy. Gregory Harlan had written his in patience, not anger. A month later, the media finally moved on. The news vans disappeared, the headlines faded, and the story of the HOA scandal was replaced by fresher controversies. But inside the neighborhood, things had changed permanently. People were polite, but distant. Conversations were shorter. The annual summer cookout, once the highlight of Maplewood, was quietly canceled. Gregory didn't mind the quiet. He'd finally gotten what he always wanted, peace. But peace, he realized, comes with a cost. He couldn't walk down Maplewood Drive without noticing how people avoided his eyes, how they tried too hard to act normal. Some carried guilt, others resentment, and a few, he suspected, were still waiting for him to move away. He didn't. Every morning, he still jogged past Greenfield Park, waved to the bakery owner on Old Mill Road, and came home to the same porch. The same house, with the mailbox freshly painted and the flag fluttering above it. That flag meant something different now.